Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 335 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, we'll be discussing the Netflix original series Maniac, starring Jonah Hill and Emma Stone. And this will involve spoilers for everything in the show, so just be aware of that. And I'm joined by three guests. So first up, we've got Rajan Khanna, making his 11th appearance on the show. He's the author of the post-apocalyptic novels Falling Sky, Rising Tide, and Raining Fire. And his short fiction appears in magazines such as Lightspeed, Shimmer, and Beneath Ceaseless Skies. His articles have appeared on Tor.com and LitReactor.com. So Raj, welcome to the show.
Thanks, always happy to be back.
Then next up, we've got Chandler Klang Smith, who you may remember from our feature interview back in episode 301. Her debut novel, The Sky Is Yours, about a surreal science fiction city that for decades has been under attack by dragons, was published earlier this year by Hogarth. She's also served twice as a juror for the Shirley Jackson Awards, and she currently teaches in the Creative Writing MFA program at Sarah Lawrence College. So Chandler, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
And also joining us today is Matthew Kressel, who you may remember from our panel on Solo back in episode 312, our panel on Blade Runner 2049 back in episode 277, and our panel on Jewish science fiction back in episode 172. He's the author of the novel King of Shards, and his short story The Last Novelist, or A Dead Lizard in the Yard, was nominated for the Nebula Award and was a finalist for the Eugene Foster Memorial Award. Together with Ellen Datlow, he hosts the monthly Fantastic Fiction reading series at the KGB Bar in New York. So Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Great always to be here.
Okay, so let's start off with Chandler. And before we actually get to the show, I just wanted to congratulate you on your new teaching job. And could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's been really fabulous. I've been teaching a craft course at Sarah Lawrence College in the MFA program. So the craft classes are interesting because they're a combination of, reading assignments and then also like creative writing exercises. But it's been a great chance to revisit some of my favorite books. So the class is called Lost in the Maze, and we're reading speculative fiction where characters are enmeshed in systems beyond their knowledge or control, which actually kind of fits in really nicely with the themes of Maniac.
Yeah. Well, it's something we've talked a lot about on this podcast is how people will go to study creative writing in college, and often the courses are not particularly friendly to fantasy and science fiction. And yeah. So I think it's really cool that Sarah Lawrence just started up this speculative fiction track in the MFA program.
Yeah, that's something that I was so enthusiastic about because I really do feel like the tools and strategies that we use as speculative fiction writers are often a little bit different. And, being able to even just name the problems that you're having in your work is such a powerful tool. And then, also being inspired by other writers who are trying to do similar things. So, yeah, it's been a really wonderful opportunity for me.
Yeah, so everyone go check out that program. Maybe you can take a class with Chandler. She's an excellent writer.
Well, thank you so much.
So why don't you tell us, Chandler, let's get to Maniac, and just have you tell us sort of why did you decide to watch this show in the first place, and what were your expectations going into it?
Well, I actually was familiar with the writer Patrick Somerville, who's the creator of the show, because I reviewed his book, The Universe in Miniature, for the KGB Bar Lit Mag back probably like the better part of a decade ago. And that book just made a real impression on me. The way that it kind of used, in that book, there's the device for understanding other people, I think it's called, which in some ways is similar to the technology that's explored in the show. The idea of, a machine or computer that can help you access another person's consciousness. And I just thought that was a really elegant, moving, memorable work. So when I found out that he was a creator of the show, that also seemed like it had, other influences like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind was something that I heard it compared to early on. The visuals reminded me of some of Terry Gilliam's work, and he's one of my favorite directors. I was just super, super intrigued. I'm not a big TV watcher in general, but I was kind of sucked into this right away. So yeah, those were some of the reasons that I was attracted to it.
That's interesting. I was noticing, I was not familiar with Patrick Somerville. I mean, I know that he did, he was a writer on The Leftovers, particularly, I think, seasons 2 and 3, which from what I've heard, I haven't watched it, but from what I've heard are considered some of the best seasons of the show. But so I was just looking that he has published, I think, 2 novels and 2 short story collections. And certainly that recent collection you mentioned, which came out in 2010, looks like it had a lot of, speculative elements in it. So yeah, that's just kind of interesting background for the show.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's definitely a book that's worth checking out for if you enjoyed Maniac. I think that you would enjoy that book as well.
Yeah, cool. All right, so how about Matt? What were your expectations going into the show?
I pretty much went in blind. I think I saw someone mention it on Facebook as, oh, hey, I'm watching the show. It's really interesting. And it came up, we were watching some Netflix show, and it came up as like a suggested series. So I just gave it a chance. And I think I was immediately taken in sort of by the visual aesthetic of it, just that kind of 80s retro futurism. And there was also this really interesting character development that went on in the first episode that I thought was intriguing. It's something that I hadn't seen before or recently in a series. And I wasn't completely blown away by the first episode, but I was intrigued enough to keep watching, and I'm really happy that I did.
Were you familiar with the director of this? His name is Cary Fukunaga. He's known for the first season, known as the good season of True Detective.
I've heard his name mentioned before. I loved the first season of True Detective. I thought that was fantastic television, and I've heard his name mentioned before, but it wasn't until like I went and looked up the director of this that I said, oh, that's the same guy. But I thought it was incredibly well directed.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you about the visual aesthetic. I think that's for me, would be the primary strength of the show. It has other strengths, has some weaknesses in my opinion, but the visual aesthetic is very, very strong in my opinion. How about Raj? Expectations, initial impressions?
I don't know that I think I tried to keep my expectations low because by the time I had heard that it was out, I think people were already buzzing about it on social media, and I didn't want to go in with any real expectations, except that I heard that it was going to be kind of trippy, and the images seemed to suggest that. And so I think I tried to keep myself kind of blind to it. I wanted it to be weird. I know that. So and that's what it seemed to be going for. And I think, yeah, initial impressions. I'll agree with you guys in terms of the visuals. I think that is definitely one of the strengths of the show. And I watched the whole thing with my girlfriend, Elizabeth, and we just kept like giving raves to the art direction on the whole thing. And I'm just a sucker for, I guess, what I call retro futures, where like it's the future, but it's clearly inspired by a period of our past. So, the game Fallout, for example, which comes out of like the kind of 50s and 60s aesthetic. And this with its whole kind of 80s thing just really worked for me, since that was a era that I grew up in. So yeah.
And your girlfriend is a filmmaker, right?
She's a filmmaker. She's a producer. She works in casting as well. So yeah, she's worked in that field for a while.
So did she have any special filmmaker insights on the cinematography or anything? I guess we didn't really talk about that at this point. We finished it fairly recently, but I think, again, the direction was something that we both, appreciated throughout. I agree with you that I felt like it had some weaknesses, but it was generally just enjoyable. Like, it's one of those things for me that I feel like I enjoyed it enough that while I recognized the flaws in it, they didn't really kind of grate at me the way that they would if it wasn't quite as satisfying. And I just like seeing something like that out there, and I know Netflix puts out a lot of variety of stuff, but the fact that this is one of their big, things right now, I want more of that kind of stuff, I guess. So I'm happy to see it. Yeah, I agree with that completely. And I'm going to have some criticisms of this show, but I am happy to see science fiction on television with, artistic ambition and obviously a big budget and a unique voice. I think, you have to give the show all that. Matt, you said that the first episode you were kind of like had mixed feelings about. Why was that?
I'm trying to, recreate my ignorance. So like going back to trying to remember the specific feelings, but I think I was worried it was going to be, almost like nihilistic, just sort of like, that reality, you can't trust reality, that nothing is real, that nothing is worth anything. And I was afraid that they were going to handle mental illness in a bad way. So, for example, in the Silver Linings Playbook, which I thought most of that film actually handled mental illness really well, but I thought that they destroyed their own setup by basically having the characters live this sort of happily ever after at the end. The message of the movie that at least I took, maybe others didn't, was that, all you need is a companion who loves you, that you love, and then everything will be fine. And I think that, because I have family members who are mentally ill and have had others that have passed away, and, paranoid schizophrenia, for example, and I've seen this with real people, I was just afraid that it was going to be handled poorly. And I was also kind of afraid that it was just going to be kind of a pastiche of other things, but wouldn't have its own voice. And I was really pleasantly surprised with all of those aspects, which I guess we can get into. But I just was, I really enjoyed how thoughtful it was, and how it was not afraid to talk about trauma, which I feel like a lot of times, storytelling doesn't really deal with trauma, I think, in a realistic way. And I thought that the series handled it very deftly.
Well, let me pick up on what you were saying about mental illness, because this is actually based on a Norwegian TV series, also called Maniac. I couldn't find a lot of information about it, but from what I understand, it's very, very different. That they basically just took a couple ideas from that and basically spun out something completely different. But one of the things I heard the creators of this show say is that one of the things they wanted to do differently from the Norwegian show was they felt that in that show, a lot of the humor had come out of sort of, isn't it funny that people with mental illness don't understand what's going on around them or what's really happening? And they wanted to not handle it that way. They wanted the humor to not be about mental illness being funny for people who don't have mental illness. So I think, the sort of concerns that you're expressing, I think the filmmakers were sort of were cognizant of that and at least trying to handle that in a sort of responsible way. But why don't we get into what the show is actually about? So Chandler, why don't you tell us about sort of the show was set in sort of, as I think Matt was mentioning, sort of a weird retro-futurist sort of setting. What were your impressions of the setting? Just tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that especially on a second watch of the series, I was really struck by how well the world building was done, actually. I mean, it seems like a lot of the world building is tied in thematically to what's going on with the characters, which I think is always an excellent choice, to have sort of everything in the story pointing in the same direction. So a couple of things that are, important, semi-futuristic aspects of this world. One is ad buddies. So it seems like it's kind of modeled on the way that if you don't have a subscription to certain websites, then they'll show you ads, but you can also pay to have those ads removed. It's the idea of that kind of carrying over into Meatspace. So someone with a briefcase full of ads will basically follow you around and talk through ads at you if you can't pay for basically any product in a store. You can pay for it with an ad buddy instead. So in an early scene, Emma Stone's character, Annie, is going to buy cigarettes, and she says, I'll have an ad buddy, to pay for this purchase. And the guy says, no, you can't have an ad buddy. We don't accept ad buddies here because they listen in on your conversations. So there's a sort of idea of what we have in our world as an online surveillance and ad culture has been translated into into external space. It's been sort of literalized in this really interesting way. And I thought that was such a smart idea, a way of commenting on something, technological in our own culture, but making it visible to us in a new way.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So it takes sort of features of our internet life and translates them into analog technologies.
Yeah. And not only does it translate them into analog technologies, but it kind of hones in on how those technologies relate to loneliness and to this idea of being seen but not understood, which seems to be something that the characters are experiencing. another like I hesitate to call it technology exactly, but another like service that's in the show is the idea of the friend proxy, where you can hire somebody to, pretend to be your friend, seemingly to pretend to be a specific friend or person who's missing from your life. And it seems like that's sort of, my impression is that is kind of about the way that we'll sometimes substitute a service, like maybe even Netflix itself, for, experiences that might be a little bit more challenging and unpredictable. So, I was very taken by that.
Or I've heard a lot of people say that, they listen to so many podcasts that the people on the podcast become like their friends. They feel closer to them than, their sort of Meatspace friends. I hope all our listeners feel that way. But, it's that same sort of translation into a non-digital sort of, format.
Yeah.
How about Raj? Do you have anything you want to add about the retrofuturism?
Well, I just want to say that, I'm surprised that Matt said that, the first episode he was questionable on, because I think in that first episode, when we see, the ad buddies and a lot of these other little world building choices, I think that's kind of what sold me on it. And, they kind of fade out as we go through the different, I guess, dream or whatever experiences you want to call it that the characters are having after they become part of the experiment. But I just loved all those little bits and pieces, which, they don't hit too hard. They're just kind of there in the background, but I felt like it made the world feel real to me. And I thought they were amazing ideas that I'm surprised I haven't seen before.
I totally agree with that, Raj. I was totally on board with this from the start for exactly the reason you're stating. I loved the little retro futurist dystopian sort of elements. I'll mention a couple more. There's something called, I think it's Avoid, which is this pod in your backyard that you just kind of go into. Presumably there's some sort of virtual reality environment inside, and there's sort of like hoses for food and water or whatever. And
perfect name too for that. I mean, that's like a perfect name for that in this world, especially like the avoid obviously as the obvious thing, but a void, like it. Those kind of things, I just love when people find the perfect word for something. It's great.
And also like the little pooper scoopers, the little robots that were going through the streets. I mean, to me, they looked like the exact same shape, just the avoid was larger. So it was almost like he was hiding inside a pooper scooper.
Oh, I didn't even make that connection, but I really love that. The idea of that being kind of a visual echo, that like it's sort of the thing that scoops up all your shit, whether that's emotional shit or literal shit.
Right. I mean, there's so much in the series like that, these little things that reward like careful attention. I wish I had the time to watch it twice like you did, you did, Chandler, because I can see like there's so much there that I probably missed the first time through. I actually saw the first episode twice because I watched it once on my own, and then we had some friends over, Teresa DeLucci, who was on I know has been on your podcast before. I watched it again with them, and then the second time through the first episode, I was like, oh wow, I missed all these little connections. That's pretty cool. So I'm jealous that you got to watch it all the way through twice.
I think it really rewards, for further reviewing of it, because I feel like there's still stuff that I probably missed even on the second time through. Another piece of technology that I think I'd be remiss not to mention is the sort of weird turn pornography has taken in this world, which we see with James's character, the doctor, Dr. James Mantle-Ray. So yeah, what did you guys make of that? I feel like that also ties into those ideas of loneliness and disconnection.
I feel like that's an inevitable development.
But I feel like it's an inevitable development, but I also feel like, like what Chandler said, in the sense like the series to me is about, loneliness and isolation and this hunger for connection, right? So you can't afford something, so you get an ad buddy. They're called an ad buddy, like a buddy is like a synonym for a friend, but they're not really your friend, right? And then the same thing with like friend proxy. You're paying someone to be your friend, but they're not really your friend. And then you have like the technology where the guy hides in a box, a void, and then, this pornography, which is like, Dr. Mantle-Ray, he's not connecting with a human being. He's connecting with software. And there's a hint through the show that he actually had some kind of, weird romantic relationship with the AI, Gerda, and that's why he was canned. At least that's the way I read it. So it's like, it's to me, it's like this theme of loneliness and alienation running through the whole series.
I also just want to mention, so there's doxing is apparently so common in this world that there's an actual store like Docs. It's called DocStop, and it's like a Kinko's or something. You just go in and get blackmail material on whoever. There's like a robot koala, like a obscene robot koala character.
Oh yeah,
the chess player.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was just so weird. I didn't even know how to place that in context of anything.
But I feel like the unifying thread of a lot of these is, the koala, the suck tube pornography, like the friend proxy, all of these things are about substituting the sort of vagaries of real connection with something that is kind of like, a system that is more predictable. And then the system that's so central to this, the GRTA or
actually, wait. Let's wait a little bit to get into that.
Okay, absolutely.
That's like the whole show.
Yeah, totally.
But let me just, I also just want to mention from the first episode, the part I found the most striking was there's this Statue of Extra Liberty. So like rather than the Statue of Liberty, there's this big statue, and it's like has these massive wings and seems to be holding some sort of globe or skull or something, and then a knife or thunderbolt or something as if it's about to stab, or I'm not even sure. It's super weird, but there was just something so just eerie to me about that. And once they called it the Statue of Extra Liberty, and actually I don't think I would have known this from watching the show, but apparently there's still in this world, there's the Statue of Liberty, and this is looking in a different direction. They built another one, the Statue of Extra Liberty, because one Statue of Liberty isn't enough. And in interviews I read, they didn't really explain what the thinking was behind that. Kind of the way I read it was that this is such a sort of consumerist world, and there's so much rhetoric around sort of conflating personal freedom with lack of regulations, that may be part of the ethos of this world, is that, part of the reason consumerism is so rampant is because it's been associated with personal liberty in this really sort of overt way. I don't know, does anyone have any other, Raj, do you have any thoughts on the Statue of Extra Liberty? Did you like that?
You know what? I have to say that I know I noticed it, but it didn't really stick with me until, and it must have just been maybe I looked away or something like that. But now that you're talking about, I mean, I do love that kind of thing, and I agree with you that I find that to be creepy. It's almost like taking a kind of enshrined monument that means something good to a lot of people, and then putting a new shiny version that's kind of aggressive in the same vein, which seems like it's co-opting this great thing for something sinister. So yeah, I mean, but again, like a little thing like that is such a delicate touch that adds, so much to the feel of the world that they've created.
Does anyone know what the Statue of Extra Liberty is holding? I don't mean to seem obsessed with the Statue of Extra Liberty, but I did like that.
I didn't, I saw mention of it, but not what it was holding. I mean, to me, like I read that, I mean, not read that, but like I interpreted that when it crossed the screen, like, okay, this is not our world. When I first saw it, because I didn't really know anything about the show, what kind of world we were in, I was like, okay, this is either an alternate reality or he's just like, completely hallucinating and we can't trust anything in this world.
Right.
Well, what is it holding?
Well, like it's so far in the distance you can't quite tell. Like I said, it seems to be holding some sort of knife or something and some sort of globe or something, but I don't know what they're meant to be.
It could be a lightning bolt or something round. I saw somebody mention it could be an apple or something like that, but I don't. It's unclear from the distance you see it at.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So Matt, since you mentioned the schizophrenia and where you're not sure if anything in the show is real initially. Let's get into that. Why don't you tell us about our main character, Owen Milgram? Okay,
so Owen Milgram is part of this super rich family. I believe they got rich from the Pooper Scoopers, if I'm not mistaken. And so basically, he is diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, like, I guess, what was it, 10 years before the show, or 6 years? I don't remember exactly. 10 years before the events of the show take place. He had a so-called blip where he had a psychotic break, and he thought that some girl he was seeing was a setup by his family, and he freaked out. But his brother...
That she had been hired to be his girlfriend.
She had been hired to be his girlfriend. And his brother is on trial for what we later learn is for urinating on a woman, and his family asks him to lie and say that, oh, his brother was with him the whole night. He couldn't have done this in order to protect the family name. So Owen starts off the series as being very shy, very withdrawn, very distrusting of others, even himself. And he also sees an hallucination of like an alternate version of his brother. That's an hallucination. It's an alternate version of his brother, but the brother has a mustache, and he tells him that, oh, you're part of the secret mission. You know, you're part of this great mission. You're going to save the universe. So basically what happens is, after Owen can't afford a subway ride, so he gets an ad buddy. The ad buddy's talking to him. And as soon as he gets home, he gets a call from this pharmaceutical company saying, we want you to participate in this trial of this new drug that could potentially cure you. And so basically he decides to enter into this drug trial at this pharmaceutical company.
Right. And I don't know if you mentioned, he lost his job, so he needs money, and he doesn't want to take money from his family. I also just want to, point of order, the brother, this is maybe not the most important thing, but the brother, was he peeing on somebody, or did he coerce someone into peeing on him? I thought it was the latter.
I thought he was the PE, if that's a word.
I think he was, the PE, okay.
And it was also work, it was in the workplace, so he actually
It was an
used
employee,
yeah.
When they're preparing for the trial, there's a line about, have you ever seen your brother participate in a consensual or non-consensual act of urination? But I guess that could go either way.
Well,
and all of the papers throughout the show say things like Bladdergate and pissed off. I don't know if you guys noticed that.
I didn't notice that.
It seems like the family's business is just all associated in, bodily functions.
But I just want to bring special note to the actor who plays the brother. I think his name is Billy Magnussen. He was also the douchey brother in Ingrid Goes West. I don't know if anyone saw that, but it's like it's almost like he was genetically engineered in a lab to play a douchey brother. Like it's like his face is just like so perfect for that kind of role. And just maybe get a little ahead, but the flashback where he sings "Every Breath You Take" when he proposes to his girlfriend, just like everything about his body language is just so amazingly douchey. I mean, it's almost supernatural. All right. So getting back, so that's, is there anything else we need to say about Owen by way of setup here?
I actually think that there's another significant thing, which is that, before he actually meets Annie, Emma Stone's character, at the testing facility, he's been seeing her face everywhere because she sold her face to ad companies.
Yeah.
So he thinks that they have some sort of destiny together because she's been kind of following him around, the same way that an ad follows us around from YouTube to Facebook to Twitter. When you see an ad that's attracted your attention, it follows you. That happens on, bus stations and billboards and stuff in the real world, in the world of this TV show.
And this is also precipitated by his hallucinated version of his brother telling him that, someone's going to make contact with you. You'll know it when you see them. You'll know them when you see them. So it sort of leads him to think that she is this contact.
Yeah, so he thinks they have a special connection going in, and then they do sort of end up developing a special connection for reasons both accidental and not.
Let me just mention about Owen, too. His last name is Milgram, and this is a reference to the Milgram experiment, which was this experiment where Stanley Milgram basically demonstrated that test subjects would do anything that a sort of the person running the experiment would tell them to do, up to and including giving people electric shocks until they lost consciousness. So just a little context there. But Chandler, why don't you tell us about this other major character, Annie, played by Emma Stone?
Well, I guess that the order in which we learn things about her is sort of different than the order in which they happen. So I guess I'll start with the way she's presented in the show. So when we first meet her, she's posting these lost dog flyers of a dog that there's a picture of it, and then 7 years later, like artists rendering of what the dog would look like 7 years after it was lost, which seems like she's kind of stuck in the past. And we also find out that she has become addicted to this drug, the A pill, which she grinds up and snorts like it's cocaine. And it seems the first time we see her use it, we're not inside of her consciousness. We're just observing her. And it seems like she basically passes out for an entire day on the couch in this shared apartment where she's living with a bunch of kind of bohemian characters, it seems like. I think it's kind of implied
who she doesn't get along with.
She does not get along with them, no. And yeah, then she announces that she is planning a trip to Salt Lake City to see her sister that she might finance with ad buddies along the way. And she goes to visit her father, who is spending time in the A void in his backyard, to tell him of this plan. She takes a bunch of his money, but when she goes to the train station to depart, she looks at the listing of all of the departures, and all she ends up seeing is the letter A. So she decides, okay, she's out of the pills that she's been taking.
Which is a beautiful scene, by the way.
So good. I love that part. It's such a memorable, dreamlike, and haunting image. And it's like, yeah, I think that was just excellently done. But anyway, so she's out of these pills, desperate to get more. She finds out from the guy that she originally got them from that they're from his father's work, which is Neberdine Pharmaceuticals. So via blackmail, of a woman who works at the facility, she manages to get herself inserted into this trial where she'll get another A pill. But what she's not necessarily expecting is that she's also going to get these B and C pills, which have different but related effects. So that's sort of the way her character is set up, as this aggressive, confrontational, drug-seeking person who seems to have these moments of remorse for her behavior, but then ends up persisting in it anyway. But then she ends up getting a lot more complicated, as does her backstory as the series progresses.
Right. So let's get to that in a little bit. So Raj, what did you think of the Neberdine pharmaceutical trials?
Well, I mean, I think they're presented again as part of this retro future that they create here. So everything looks like it's an Atari factory or something like that. I love the little stripe of colors across the wall, but it's. I think my first impression was they show us this kind of future dystopia or, alternate present dystopia. And so I think pharmaceutical companies often get linked to that. I mean, Philip K. Dick did a lot with, pharmaceuticals that people take. And,
and there's a huge, this whole first 3 episodes has a very strong Philip K. Dick feel to it.
Yeah. Yeah. What I think back to is that video that they show everyone when they come in, which is, again, so retro and cheesy, and it looks like an infomercial kind of thing, and it tells them exactly what's going to happen. But I think actually that was the moment where I was like fully in for this show. I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And I loved the idea of the 3 pills and, this kind of massive technology that they had put together. I guess we don't really learn about Gerda in that point, right? But
well, we know that. No, we do, because in the orientation video, it says that their microwaves are going to like analyze their brain patterns, and this super intelligent computer is going to rewire their brains to make them mentally healthy.
Yeah. So I mean, I thought everything about that was kind of creepy and cheesy and looked amazing, and I thought Justin Theroux was awesome as Dr. Mantle-Ray, and I love Izumi as well. So like with those two in there, although I guess he comes in later, but he's on the video. He's the first face we see. And so, just everything about that just worked for me. Like I never got tired of seeing those people and that place and, the little weird pods that they had to sleep in between these sessions where they're put into the machines and given pills and they have these dreams. And of course, you're set up to, or I would think you're set up. I was set up to think that this is not going to be an up and up kind of situation where things are definitely not going to go the way that they expect. And there's the aims of Neberdine are very different from what they're telling the patients who are coming in. But it seems like there are all these people who are just desperate for this kind of thing. I mean, the waiting room is full of people. They have all those numbers. I mean, Annie has to basically intimidate her way into the trial. So it's kind of like a great blend of the mundane nature of like waiting in lines and having to fill out paperwork and having to go through that kind of process. And then this kind of sinister, inner pharmaceutical company that comes out of the 80s sort of.
Right. Let me say about the orientation video. So they're told that they're going to take these 3 pills, pill A, B, and C, which is agonia, which is going to dredge up their most painful memories, behavioral, which is going to lower their self-defense mechanisms, and confraxia, which is going to make them confront the things that they most need to confront about themselves. And we're also told that they're going to be entering some sorts of dream hallucinations in between each of these stages. So how about, let's get back to Chandler. What did you think of this whole like process of taking the pills and having the dreams?
I think for me, the first really big surprise in the series came when the second time we see Annie take the A pill, we actually get to see what is going on inside of her consciousness. When I first saw her, sort of nod off on the couch, you kind of assume that it's maybe something sort of like heroin, that it's something that gives you a feeling that's euphoric, but kind of immobilizing, and that, that it gives you this sort of release or relief from your problems. But then when she actually takes it, what we discover is that that's not what the A pill does at all. As you mentioned, the A pill thrusts you back into like your most terrible memory, the most traumatizing event of your life, which in her case, like obviously this is all spoilers, but it turns out to be the death of her sister at the end of, a weekend where they had been fighting, and Annie feels some responsibility for it because she was the one driving the car. And I was so shocked by that. It was a case where it was one of those moments in fiction where something is totally unexpected, but also feels really, really right. So I really loved that, it was not actually just that Annie gets to check out of her problems, but actually that she gets to sort of scrape that wound, and it makes her feel worse, but also like she's closer to the moment where things went wrong, and that there's either a fantasy of being able to do things differently, or even just as she says, she gets to spend another day with her sister. So yeah, I was really taken by that, and it made me kind of reevaluate everything I felt like I knew about her character up to that point.
And going back to the cinematography, the way that accident is shot, I thought was amazing. The way the camera's fixed on her as she sort of, or no, maybe I guess it's just fixed on the car as she sort of falls out of the door as the car keeps rolling off the cliff. I just thought it was brilliant.
Yeah, we see the car turning, and that they almost are like thrown loose of gravity in that moment, and it's just it's so gutting and genuinely affecting. And then right after that, she has a conversation with another one of the patients who's saying, well, I also relived this traumatic memory, but it wasn't the way that I remembered it. Was that reality, or was that something else? And it really is just something I think about, like the nature of memory. Yeah.
Right. And so then we also, so Owen sort of pretends to take the pill, but doesn't. And so he tells the first doctor that we meet, Dr. Robert Muramoto, I think, about a traumatic experience from his past. And we don't know if he's telling the truth or not. But how about Matt? What did you think of, do you remember this, where this was the engagement party scene?
Yeah, so I guess what struck me about this scene the most was kind of how, like, echoing what Chandler said, was just sort of like the reality of it. Like this, this was somebody who has basically been ignored by his family completely, and who is in a situation, and anytime he expresses his own needs, it's shunned or frowned upon or ignored. And so I was basically just struck by how true that felt. And I think that's when I really connected with Owen's character at that point. I think once I realized like how shitty a life he has with his family, and how alone he is, and even with a mental illness. So for me, that really worked.
Well, right. And we find out that he has 4 brothers who all seem to be sort of happy and successful and popular. And he, like, they don't even have, there's this funny thing where they've painted sort of a family portrait, and they haven't included him yet. And then they say that they're going to get around to the painters. He's traveling or something, but someday they're going to paint him in there. And then we also find out that his, brother Jed has a fiance, Adelaide, who is seemingly the only person in the family who's nice to Owen, and who he clearly seems to have sort of a crush on.
Right.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's see. Okay, so how about I guess then, is there anything else that we should set up before we start getting into the dreams sequences? I think we're good. All right.
Yeah, I mean, Owen also recaps, like, when he actually does revisit his most terrible memory. We actually don't see his hallucination, but he tells Annie what it was, and it's when he had his blip, when he, screamed at that girl in college. So we learned that that's sort of the locus of his trauma, even though it's not dramatized, which I thought was an interesting choice. Yeah. I wondered if anybody had thoughts about, like, why we don't see that scene.
It was curious to me why we didn't see that scene either, because I felt that it was very integral to his character. But I also feel like, the show is very much about questioning reality, what's real, what's the nature of memory, in a very Philip K. Dick sense. And so I think it was like, if we had experienced that memory from him, I mean, would it have been exactly what happened, or is that just the story that he's telling himself in order to survive? So I mean, I don't know if it was just a narrative choice because they wanted to move the story along. I don't know. What did you guys think of it?
I almost felt like it was the show protecting his privacy in a certain way, that, like, he's such a fragile character, and it's something that I almost felt like it was an opportunity to let Owen, the character as we know him now, like, reframe that story somehow. But yeah, I did think it was a marked choice because, so much other stuff is dramatized, like Annie's trauma is dramatized. So yeah, and then we meet Olivia later in some of the fantasies, the girl that he screamed at, and it's interesting that we only get those sort of fantasy versions of her. We don't have anything that even is purporting to be real to compare them to.
It's also that, I mean, yeah, that seems to be what he considers, his kind of traumatic moment that would have come out. But for me, his everyday existence, he feels a slave to his schizophrenia, and he feels tormented by both his family and the feeling of his own disease. And I think that's like his big issue. It's not just that one moment. It's like his day-to-day life in a way. And so, they've kind of helped us with that.
Yeah, because like his worst day that he recounts is his paranoia that his family engineered this whole thing. Like that his family is like manipulating him in this evil way. And it turns out that they are, it's just not the way that he imagined it.
Yeah, in a way, that's a really good point. In a way, it allows us to see what was accurate about his blip, as opposed to focusing on what was, out of control and delusional about it. So yeah, I think that maybe that was part of the rationale for not dramatizing it, is that like it helps us focus on like the sort of structure or content of it, like what it was he was so afraid of.
And I guess I'll just I think we should emphasize, I mean, we mentioned that his family is trying to pressure him to give a false alibi for his brother. But so the structure to me, it reminded me a lot of Scent of a Woman, where you have a character who, knows that he's going to have to testify, and he, and he's very conflicted about it. And then he goes on some crazy adventure in the middle of the movie. And then, then the testifying thing sort of comes back at the end. But let's get into these dream sequences. So they all take I guess it's the B pill, right? And then they start having the characters start having these dreams where it's just they're different people, and they're having very odd adventures that are sort of like linked in interesting ways to things that we know about them in the real world. And I have to say, as I said, I was totally into this show up to this point. I loved the dystopian stuff and the paranoia and everything. And the show kind of lost me with episode 4, where there's this sort of, it was like Fargo or something. There's sort of like lemur kidnapping adventure with gangsters and stuff. And I felt like that was just, it felt very disconnected to me from the rest of the story up to that point. And I felt like it just wasn't as interesting to me as the more science fictional conspiracy kind of stuff that had come before. But how about Raj? I
disagree.
Wait. Let's see if anyone agrees with me, because I know you disagree. But so Raj, do you agree with me or do you disagree with me?
I mean, I can see how you would feel that way, but I think I was, knowing the show was kind of weird. I appreciated when they started introducing these different like worlds as dreams. I'm always a sucker for alternate realities and things, and so it kind of fits in with that kind of vein to me. And I actually loved that episode, and I loved the kind of oddness of it, because, it is kind of, I guess, Fargo is a good comparison, but, it's a bit of an action kind of thing told through a completely ridiculous story. And I thought it was completely charming and funny and interesting. And, just the ridiculousness of seeing, him, I just blanked on his name, the guy who plays Owen with a mullet, and, Jonah Hill, sorry, with a mullet, and the lemur, a lemur being like, the big thing that they're trying to get is a lemur that, belonged to, a patient that Annie's character was taken care of and who died. And I don't know, there's something about how quirky it was and unexpected that made me love it. There are others that came later that I was less interested in, although, other things come up later as well. But I think this first one, I think is probably my favorite of all of them.
Matt, what do you think?
I was with you at first, Dave. So I really missed the sort of 80s retrofuturism, but I understand you couldn't have the entire show just take place in that lab, or you could, but it was extremely cloistered, and I think more things needed to happen. One of the things about narratives that have dream sequences, is I often don't like them because the dreams don't usually mean anything. They don't have any consequences. But I think I learned to really love these episodes because they do mean things. Once you realize that the narrative arc is their path towards dealing with their trauma, you realize that these dreams are revealing things about these characters that they themselves didn't know. For example, Annie is doing this thing that she feels she has to do, save this lemur, but it turns out that is actually the worst thing she could possibly do, because it was an FU from the lemur owners, to her daughter. And Annie never even considered that. It was always about what she wanted, not what other people wanted. And then Owen is just extremely passive in this and literally takes the fall for her at the end, which is exactly what his family is asking him to do, take the fall. I felt like not all of the dream sequences worked for me. In particular, I wasn't super in love with the fantasy sequence, the sort of the Lord of the Rings analog, even though I did recognize where they shot that. They shot that in Minnewaska State Park, just 2 hours north of Manhattan. But so not all the dreams worked narratively for me, but I thought overall, I really liked that the show was not afraid to use that to tell a story, because at the end of each dream sequence, you learn more about the character and about their defense mechanisms and their trauma and the things that they're unwilling to accept. And so as I'm watching it, I was sort of iffy on it, but in retrospect, thinking about it now, I think I really enjoyed them.
I mean, I don't have a problem in principle with dream sequences. I mean, I liked some of these. I liked the seance one. I liked the sort of Doctor Strangelove alien one.
Yes.
And I liked, I forget, but I basically liked the ones that maintained for me the sort of a little bit of the creepy science fiction mystery conspiracy kind of vibe, but the more sort of like gangster sort of, criminals ones, they just didn't seem to fit particularly to me, right? At least I didn't like them as much as the other stuff. But so Chandler, I'll give you a chance now here why don't you jump in and defend the dream sequences?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would echo what like Matt was saying about like, I think that, a dream sequence having consequences is pretty primary for me in terms of like thinking if it works or not. I think the thing that's really haunting to me about the lemur episode specifically, though, is so did you guys catch that the reason that she's delivering the lemur, at first it's like, she's supposed to be a nurse who was taking care of this dying woman who was estranged from her daughter. And the woman says, if you give her this lemur after I die, it will like heal this rift between us. When she ultimately, after much violence along the way, delivers the lemur, it turns out that it's not like an I love you lemur, it's an F you lemur, is right. The way that the daughter describes it. And then she says, my mother wrote me this letter saying that it's better to have a lemur than to have a human child. You shouldn't have a child. But then she's like, joke's on her. I'm already pregnant and I'm going to name the baby Greg F.U. Nan Naslund. The name of the dying woman was Nan. We find out elsewhere that the truck driver who killed Annie's sister and, caused that car crash, he was, falling asleep after several days being on NoDoz, was Greg Fun Naslund. His middle name was Fun, and so she says that she's going to name him Greg F.U. Nan Naslund, F.U.N. Naslund. So it's supposed to be that she's trying to prevent the conception of the guy who killed her sister in reality. And I think that there's just, for me, this really creepy turn at that point in the story when she's sort of realizing how this connects. She's had this kind of really, really chirpy, like charming, like, almost like a character from a sitcom kind of persona throughout the episode. But as this is unfolding in this woman's living room, she actually says in this sort of affectless way, maybe she's right, maybe you shouldn't have kids. And at that same moment, like a truck driving by the house outside, makes this incredibly loud sound and startles also Jonah Hill's character, who is reading a book by Greta Mantle-Ray, mother of the guy, doing the experiment, that has a picture of Olivia, the girl from his blip, in it. So to me, the thing that was amazing about that episode was that it pulled off this really Coen Brothers pastiche kind of quality, but that then gets kind of like interrupted and unsettled the way that real dreams do. Like, when you have a dream and then you realize that the person you're talking to in the dream is dead, for example. And there's just this sort of dawning realization. So, I mean, I felt like in a way it definitely does have consequences, and that aesthetically it kind of like it manages to capture in this nightmarish way the way that like therapy can feel when you suddenly start listening to yourself and you're disturbed by what you're hearing. So that would be my argument for that particular episode.
I mean, I liked the creepy stuff you're talking about, where you see the connections to the other things, but there wasn't enough there for me personally to justify the however 20 or 30 minutes is what it felt like anyway of like wildlife shootouts with the fur smuggler guys.
Yeah, and humor is like so subjective. I mean, I found that episode really, really funny. Like all of the stuff about bulletproof furs, like, and Jonah Hill's trying all those fur coats, and as they're leaving, even though he was just doing that as a cover for her sneaking around in the back, he's like, I really liked how I felt in that. I mean, it made me laugh out loud.
The Fish and Wildlife, yeah, they have like authority-wise, we're pretty much the same thing as the cops, I thought that was great.
Well, no, and I don't disagree that it was funny. I mean, I actually was, I thought the whole show throughout was pretty funny, but a lot of it, I felt like it was funny, but it needed to, like, for me to be more tied in with the rest of the events in a more sort of narrative drive sort of way. And that's kind of what I felt was missing through a lot of the show for me.
I partly agree with you in the sense that I didn't think it was, like, there were parts I'm like, is this narratively connected to it? I mean, we come out of that and we learn a few things, but at the same time, I really appreciate the writers and directors taking risks like this. I think that, you mentioned like the Coen brothers pastiche. I actually think that, there's a perfect example of a show that's willing to take risks with narrative, and sometimes it pays off and sometimes it doesn't. So I really appreciated that aspect of it. And I also will say, I'm pretty sure that takes place on Long Island. And having grown up on Long Island, I would say that they nailed the Long Island accent really, really well. So I was just impressed with that part of it at least.
Very last thing I'll say about it is, like, there's a quote later in the show. I think it's when Jonah Hill's character is sort of in gangster mode, but there's that line about, like, brains are just computers to make our life stories make sense. And I guess I just feel like in those moments where we're really deep in fantasy, but the characters, I mean, that's what, like, the behavioral pill is supposed to be about, right? Is sort of like, what kind of, like, patterns does your brain churn through, and how do we sort of reroute those patterns? I just thought it was, like, interesting to see sort of these same characters working through, like, a totally different set of, like, a different set of imagery and circumstances. So, but I can certainly see where you're coming from, Dave.
Yeah, well, let's get Raj back in here. So, Raj, what do you make of all this we've been talking about, and just sort of overall, like, what do you like or dislike about the show as it develops?
I mean, I think, just starting off with that episode, I think when we find out that they're together in these dreams and they're not supposed to be, I found that just to be a nice way to follow through it. These two people from two different backgrounds who are somehow kind of thrown together into these dreams, and them getting to know one another, and them getting to kind of help one another through these different circumstances. I agree that I thought the episode, the first episode was fun. And then at the end it gets creepy, although I probably do need to watch it again, because when Chandler explained that, I was like, oh God, it's even better than I remember it being. But I think the next one that followed after that with the seance, I thought that was really cool. I mean, again, I guess I kind of filtered it through my appreciation of alternate realities, and I know that's not what it was, but in a way, it kind of follows that sort of path for me, with people going from place to place where everything's different, but there's certain things that carry through. I mean, I love to see Sally Field step into it, because she's amazing. Like, I think she's amazing in everything she does, but she was amazing in this, and how she pops up in the dream, and then we know that she's also Greta Mantle-Ray, and how that comes out in the background of James, that we find out. And I think I agree that so I really liked that one. I really liked the Doctor Strange love-ish kind of one. I wasn't too keen on the fantasy one. I mean, I think there were some funny parts. I laughed out loud, actually, when she said half elf instead of elf, and just because I'm a D&D nerd. But basically, that one didn't feel. I didn't have as strong a connection to that storyline. I understood what they were going for, but it didn't work for me as much. And the one where Jonah Hill has the braids also didn't work for me, just because, to me, I think the less interesting story. I mean, it worked out in the end, but I think that the whole thing with his family, the more they got into it, the less I responded to it, because I pretty much understood what was going on there. And he kept coming back to it, which I understand is part of his own psychology, but that wasn't as interesting to me. Although the part with him and I guess, was it Olivia, who's in that dream is the diner waitress, I really liked that. I thought, like, seeing those moments gave us a glimpse of what it was like for him in the past in the real world, coming out in this dream. But I mean, I understand that also was deliberately over the top, kind of violent and gory, but that shook me out of the storyline a bit more than the Lemur one did, for example. But then
I had a hard time understanding him at that. Like, he was kind of mumble speaking in those scenes, and I really had a hard time with his voice. Did anyone else have that issue?
Yeah, actually, the second time I watched the show, I put on closed captions for a lot of scenes just because I wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything, but I think that it's particularly useful in that part.
Yeah, I mean, I have just a basic... I mean, I really enjoyed Jonah Hill's performance, which I thought was hilarious, but I thought that as a character, Owen had sort of a shelf life for how interesting I found him that, sort of petered out to around episode 6 or so, where I just felt like all he ever does really in the show is say "what" in sort of a dazed way, and he never really seems to make any big choices, or he just sort of is a really passive character, and I was looking for a little bit more just agency or spark or something out of that character.
Something that I was taken with is, the way that sort of psychological violence in the fantasies becomes physical violence that's either silly and cartoony or like really gross. And I totally get why that might not work for every viewer, but that was something that I think there's something really great about being able to literalize the psychological states of your characters. So I felt like it seemed right to me that Owen, who in real life is so incredibly passive and detached, would, imagine the sort of psychological violence of his family as being this physical violence with these drills that, I don't know. Yeah. But, it was definitely, I was rewatching one of those episodes when I was eating lunch and I actually had to stop because it was so disturbing.
Yeah, I really like that part of the show, how they turn the psychological violence into physical violence in the dreams, because anyone who's ever suffered through psychological violence, and I think we all have, it hurts physically. It's physical pain in the body. And so I enjoyed that aspect of it because it made it more real.
What was I going to say? So Chandler, did you, because I agree with, I think it was Matt and Raj, that the Lord of the Rings sequence was sort of underwhelming. Do you have a robust defense of that one?
Yeah, I mean, I probably wasn't as into that as I was the Lemur episode, although the thing that I think worked for me so well there was the relationship between Annie and her sister, who's, playing the elf character that she's escorting to the Lake of the Clouds where she'll be healed. I feel like we see in the earlier scene where the sisters in real life are together in the motel, or in at least Annie's memory of real life are together in the motel, that they're watching a fantasy movie on the TV and Annie thinks that it's stupid and her sister loves it. And so that's the reason that they're in that setting. So I guess to me, I didn't see it so much as just a parody or homage to fantasy, but it's sort of about the way that genre looks to somebody who isn't herself a lover of it, but kind of has picked up enough, by osmosis from somebody else that she cares about. So I felt like, those moments where, for example, her sister is supposed to, or, the elf girl that she's escorting to the Lake of the Clouds is supposed to pay her in diamonds. And she says, I'm going to need 8 more. And she says, well, that will be extremely painful. I have to urinate them. And then Annie goes back to drinking, kind of grossed out.
No, wait, this just occurred to me. Is that a cross with Owen, the urination thing?
That's what I was just thinking too.
Yeah.
It must be. I didn't even make that connection. But I think that that didn't actually seem to me to be in any way a reference to something from the fantasy genre. It's more well, there's a bunch of weird stuff in that genre. I can imagine it being sort of weird and off-putting is more like Annie's perspective on it. But I don't know. I mean, it's not as robust a defense as the Lemur episode, but I did think that it worked for me when I was watching it.
I mean, the one thing in that I really liked was the part they are supposed to find this burning tree. And I just visually, the burning tree I thought was so striking. And then how it sort of pans over and there's the moon in the sky, the invisible moon. And just visually, again, the visual aesthetic of the show is so amazing, and that sequence, or that sort of panning shot kind of stuff, that totally worked for me.
I agree.
And I really loved that Annie's character, who's half elf, has tried to cut off her elf ears, but they're still visible. It seemed like there was something about that sort of self-abnegating impulse that's in her as a character, getting kind of literalized in a different way in this fantasy setting. So I didn't necessarily see it as doing something super original with the fantasy genre as much as just kind of reflecting the character's relationship with her sister and her own attitudes.
I mean,
about it.
The point that hadn't occurred to me, that the reason it's sort of a dumb generic fantasy is because she's not a fantasy fan and she doesn't know enough to construct a cool fantasy setting. I mean, that hadn't occurred to me. I don't know if I believe that or not, but that's kind of an interesting take on it.
I mean, you can certainly say that that's a cop-out on the part of the writers, but that was the reason that I think it worked for me.
Yeah, I'd forgotten that they were watching that in the motel room, and I think that definitely makes me appreciate it more now why they chose it. I obviously do need to go back and watch it all.
And wasn't it the movie Hawk or something from the 80s, and then Owen transforms into a hawk later to go?
Oh my God. I bet you're right about that, but I'm not familiar with that movie, so I didn't make that connection.
Is it Lady Hawk you're thinking?
Is it Lady Hawk, or is it? Yeah, I'd have to watch
with
it
Rutger Hauer and.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't remember it at all. What they showed there, so that'd be interesting.
I thought
Can we?
Oh, sorry. I thought the movie on the screen was not a real movie. It was like some sort of generic elves. It didn't seem to me like it was a real movie. It wasn't Lady Hawk for sure.
Okay.
But Chandler, go ahead.
Oh, I just was going to say, can we talk about Owen as a hawk? Because that was my favorite moment of the whole series.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, yeah, I was more just interested in other people's feelings about it. I mean, we find out that when he was a kid, he rescued this hawk from Central Park that had a broken wing, nursed it back to health, and then when it ate his brother's gerbil, his brother killed it with a hammer.
Yeah.
So in this sort of this moment of justice or self-actualization or something, when he goes to save Annie in the fantasy sequence, he turns into a hawk. But I just thought it was absolutely hilarious to hear Jonah Hill's character doing the voiceover as this hawk majestically flies between canyons of hey, Annie, it's me, it's Owen as a hawk. It's just so awkward and amazing.
That was fun.
I don't know.
I mean, I do think that sequence, I know, Dave, you were complaining about how Owen is very, he doesn't do a lot. But I think, to me, the internal journey that he goes on is basically, learning to trust himself to actually do things. And so then he takes the action of actually saving Annie, like he does save her. And then in real life, he hasn't quite had that awakening yet, in a way, until, well, I don't want to skip to the end, but, obviously I think she helps him to have that moment. He helps her, and then it kind of feeds back to one another. But I did think that was a really cool moment. And, again, the weirder the show was, the more I appreciated it. And so that was awesome. Like when he falls out of, or he jumps out of the apartment and he's in the kind of miniature scale city. And I just, going from that to the hawk all worked really well for me.
Which was a miniature scale city of his real apartment, right?
Right.
But
yeah.
Did anyone? Do you guys remember in the 80s there was that HBO sequence before a movie where they went through a model?
Sure.
Didn't it look just like that, or is it just?
I mean, I think there's similarities, definitely.
Yeah, I wonder if they were riffing on that. But yeah. But
and
yeah, it even had the advertisements.
Didn't we kind of, I mean, so my take on that place, if it's okay to talk about, is that it was kind of like the space between the different, dreams that people were having. And so he jumped out of his, he ends up in hers. Later on, Annie ends up in the same place when she has her resolution.
I think that's where he recognizes that he's in a model, quote unquote, like he's in a fictitious reality.
Right.
All right, so I think we maybe should actually skip to the end because we're running kind of short on time, and maybe we can circle back and fill in stuff depending on how much time we have. But so they undergo this whole process. It all goes horribly wrong. I guess we should maybe quickly just talk about the Dr. Mantle Ray and his coworker Azumi and Dr. Mantle Ray's mother, who we said is Sally Field, is a sort of celebrity psychologist who has books and a TV show and stuff, and or maybe it was a radio show, and is the author of such books as "I'm Okay, You're a Bitch," and seems just like an incredibly toxic person and has an incredibly toxic relationship with her son. And so we find out that the computer, they sort of like scanned her brain to create this AI system, and maybe that's part of the reason why it's so sort of dysfunctional. But so anyway, the whole project completely crashes and burns, but somehow Owen and Annie emerge from this sort of having sort of overcome a lot of their like inner conflicts that they needed to resolve. And I think, Chandler, did you say on social media that you found the ending was a little weak? For me,
it was really the last episode, not the. I actually feel like the structural end of the story is certainly the climax of the story is in episode 9, and then episode 10 is all denouement. And I actually really felt like episode 10 explained things that didn't need to be explained, that like had already been, kind of ground that had been covered symbolically already. And it also seemed like it maybe made things a little bit too easy for the two main characters. But I'm curious to hear others' takes on it.
I agree with that completely. And that was my biggest issue with that whole ending. And I actually wondered if, Netflix had said, look, we need a little bit more for people who aren't going to get what exactly happened or whatever, or we need more, because I felt like it was a little superfluous after what we had seen before. And it wrapped things up very too neatly for my taste, especially after what had come before.
So I disagree with that completely, but go ahead, Shanna.
One thing specifically, and then you can speak to this, Matt, that I found frustrating in the very last episode is that, Annie goes through this whole process with this drug, and she, has sort of figured things out, and even though she's still struggling emotionally, she's ready to start moving on, and she goes to see her dad, and she's making this emotional speech to a void in the backyard, and it turns out that he's already come out of it. That he's inside the house, that he's, found that she stole his money, and he sort of was like, I guess we're supposed to think that he thought that she was gone forever, and that in some way that galvanized him. But I had such a problem with that, because the thing is that, like, when you make a leap forward in your own psychology and your own mental health, one of the things that makes life continue to be difficult is that the people around you aren't necessarily at that same point in their journey. And it can be really hard to be like, okay, I'm in this new healthier pattern now, and this other person is still, right, for their own reasons, dragging their feet. So I felt like that just seemed to me too easy. I wanted him to be in a void, and I wanted either for him not to come out even when she asks him to, and she has to deal with that. And that's the first sort of challenge that she faces in this new state of mental stability. Or maybe she convinces him, but then it's going to be kind of a long road for him.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that Annie's relationship with her father, like, I thought that was too happy of an ending, that particular part of it. I agree that, having her continue on her journey alone would have been truer to the story that they were telling without this sort of happy, sweet ending. But, and I mentioned this earlier, like, my problem with this other film, The Silver Linings Playbook, was that, it made it seem like once you have a friend, once you have someone who loves you, you love back, that mental illness is suddenly, like, cured or now everything is going to be easy from now on or something. And having had people in my life who have suffered through this through mental illness, I know that's not the case. You could love someone to death and they just have bad brain chemistry, and so, like, I love the fact that Annie decides, Owen's fucked up, Owen's in this horrible situation, but he's got no one. His family abandoned him, and I'm not going to, and I'm going to get him out of there. And so, when they're driving away, I don't see that as a happy ending. I just see that as a transition, which I think is different. And then the other thing too, I will just say, is like, when they're coming out of the pharmaceutical trial, and they're all getting their checks and everything, if you look at their faces, not just Annie and Owen, but everyone, they don't look happy. They don't look like they reached this nirvana or they reach peace. They look devastated. They look like totally wrecked. Why? Because they went through their trauma, but they come out the other side, but they've reached an awareness. But healing is something that's like a lifelong process, and you may never heal from it, especially mental illness. So like, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Dave.
The way I read it was that the other people in the trial were not going to really come out of this experience with anything because the whole process was sort of dysfunctional and ineffectual.
Okay, that's fair.
I agree.
Only Annie and Owen came out of it with something because, due to a fluke, they had made this connection with each other that was independent of the sort of therapeutic value of the procedure.
Yeah, but I mean, in terms of like this, this ending being sort of like everything is resolved and easy and happy, I didn't read it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was resolved for the characters, but I think it was almost like spoon-fed to the audience more than anything. But I mean, I didn't hate it, I felt like it was fine and it fit in with what you were saying, Dave, is exactly how I took it, that because the Owen and Annie were together, that they had a different result than everyone else. And I think that the message or whatever, the theme that comes out of this story is one about human connection. Like even with, we have James who created a computer based on his mother because he didn't have an actual connection with his mother. And then, it comes to some kind of resolution with that, not that it's fixed. They don't become a great mother and son couple. He mentions lunch and then she's like, I'm never going to have lunch with you. And he's like, okay, fine, never see you again. So it doesn't resolve nicely, but they have a moment of connection, which actually addresses a serious problem that's going on. And later on with Izumi, he has an actual real connection, which, to me at least, gave him a more hopeful outcome than the one that he had been in before. Even though he still wants to go to Atlantis with her. But, I think to me, the whole thing, again, message of the show, not that it was giving a message, but what comes out of it is that in this world where, people are paying ad buddies and proxy friends and things like that it's human connection that can at least not heal us necessarily, but lift us out of the dark places so that we can find a better path.
Yeah, but I think like there's also this weird tragedy at the end of the show in episode 9, which I found really disturbing, especially on a second viewing. So they've created this GRTA that's based on the psychology of Manta Ray's mother, as you're saying, Sally Field's character, Greta. But then when that becomes, aberrant, when she falls in love with Robert, the doctor who dies at the beginning of the series, and is then, sort of deranged with grief for him. Ultimately, what they do is disconnect her. That, even though it seems like maybe she herself, the computer, is kind of on a path to healing, they're not patient enough to wait around for that. And I think that there's something about that that's really haunting. That computer has been orchestrating all of the healing that we see with Annie and Owen. And even though it's been, having its own ups and downs, it seems like at the end, capable of maybe change, and then it's just they unplug it.
But
I found that really affecting, actually.
Yeah.
But has the computer not been, maybe I misunderstood this, has the computer not been basically lobotomizing people so that their minds will be trapped inside it forever so that it will have company?
Yeah, but it does that because it's lonely. It's not an inhuman motivation for it to have, and yet one of the very last things the computer says before they unplug it is, "Don't punish me for being sad, James," and then he unplugs it.
Yeah.
And so there's something about that I just felt like it kind of got lost in all of the positive developments for the human characters, and I kind of wish that the show had maybe lingered on that a little bit more.
I agree.
I think that darkness is integral to what the show is about.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. To me, actually, and I don't know if any other people thought about this, but when he kills, essentially, the AI that's based on his mother, he goes through a kind of psychological catharsis in the sense that he's, sort of killing his mother in a weird way, this construct of his mother that he created, which I think, to me, and maybe this is just some weird thing that I came up with, but to me, leads him to a better place at the end, because he's been able to, I think they're all going through the same experiment, but just in different ways, like even the AI is. But also, I just want to say, before we run out of time, that one of my favorite moments was when, Annie's talking to, they call it Gertie, right? In the show. Yeah. So she's talking to Gertie in the simulation, and she says something like, when is it going to stop hurting? And a lot of TV shows and movies and things will say, it'll get better with time. And she says, it never goes away. Like, you just learn to shape your life around it. And, it was recently the anniversary of my mother's death, and I don't bring that up for any reason other than to say it was 9 years ago, and I still realize that, like, that thing about time making things less doesn't actually work. There are things that don't actually get better. And so sometimes you just have to learn how to roll with it from time to time. And so, like, that kind of honest response was something I haven't seen in fiction for a while. Yeah.
Well, let me just mention, so I listened to an interview with the screenwriter, and he said that, they had, I think it was like 8 weeks or something to write these scripts. And so he showed up for the first couple of days, and then his dad died. And so then he had to, like, go home for a couple of days and deal with that, and then come back and finish writing this show. So, obviously that influenced the way that the story developed.
Yeah, wow.
Powerfully, yeah, that's fascinating.
I just want to say, in terms of, like, my big suggestion for the end of this is that I felt like, yeah, I agree with what Chandler was saying, that a lot of the resolution is too easy or quick or something. But I particularly felt that because Owen's big character arc, I think, is supposed to be that he doesn't have the courage to stand up to his family and do what's right at the beginning, and then at the end he does. But that seems to be totally undercut by the way that it played out, where it turns out that they have video of his brother, doing the sexual misconduct. So his testimony is kind of, rendered moot. And then he says the right thing, after that, which I thought undercut it a lot. But then also he's testifying against his brother, who's just this little dick who's just been a dick to him his whole life. And I thought it would have been a lot more interesting if it was Adelaide who was the one who had done something, bad. And then Owen is in the position of having to testify against the only person in his family who's ever been nice to him at all. And then there's that and that he, kind of has feelings for. And then there's that to me. And then if he goes ahead and does what's right and testifies against her, that would be so much more, to me, so much more wrenching and just emotionally, difficult than to tell the truth about his dickhead brother, who seems to have no redeeming qualities whatsoever and who he's not that attached to anyway.
I totally agree with that. I had a similar thought, which was, I didn't think of having it be that it could be a different person that he was testifying against, but I was thinking he and his brother are both the products of this family that's, really emotionally abusive. What if in some way he really identifies with his brother, or he sees something in his brother that is worth redeeming, but then he's kind of placed in this impossible situation? Because there's a scene right before he testifies where his brother is, starts crying, and then he's like, look, these are real tears. Like, I'm really upset. But it's like, it's almost like by announcing that, it sort of tells us to distrust this, like it tells us to think this is a performance. And he also throws his mug against the wall. So he comes across really aggressive. I was like, what if the two of them really had a moment of connection, and then he has to sever that connection to do the right thing? Yeah, that would be heartbreaking.
That would be. Yeah, you should email the writers for the, Maniac series 2, or season 2.
Season 2, the revision.
Right.
Okay, so I had some listener comments. I want to maybe just throw some of these out here at the end. So let's see. Nicholas Mallow says, the most boring shit ever. Eden Rabach says, severely disappointed. This isn't bad, but everyone involved has gone for a manic energy, and if that doesn't click, then it is almost unwatchable, and I love all the creatives involved. Josh McIntyre says, I dug it. Certainly not for everyone, but damn, some of those performances were great. The two leads were exceptional, but I have to say Justin Theroux deserves a shout-out as well. And Gary Flood says, my kid will be very disappointed if you don't cite the vaporware design element in Maniac, which she spotted in minutes. I think that means the sort of retrofuturism kind of stuff we were talking about. I think maybe like, is Betamax technology sort of the standard in this world? I forget it. Maybe I'm imagining that, but...
Well, they had floppy disks, and they had monochrome screens. I mean, they had all sorts of, technology that's obsolete.
Yeah. So any other responses to that, or any other final?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say that the show is not for everyone. I think that it's a particular type of taste that it would appeal to. Some of the friends I showed it to weren't that hooked by it, but for me, what stuck with me was it ultimately had a heart, like a really big heart, which I. Like I said, I was skeptical in the first episode. I thought it was not going to be that, and I found out that it did. That was really great, and I just love the fact that they were willing to experiment with all these different narrative ways of telling a story, and that for me really worked. And so like coming out of it, I feel like I definitely would recommend that if people are curious about the show to check it out, because I haven't really seen anything like this on TV in a long time.
See, Chandler, on my Facebook page, you said that this was one of your favorite shows ever, although I think that was before you had seen the whole thing. Do you stand by that?
No, yeah, I mean, the first 9 episodes are my favorite TV drama of all time. And I would say that, like, even including episode 10, it's like definitely in my top 5. I mean, I felt incredibly moved by it. I thought it was incredibly playful and surprising. I liked that it rewards multiple watches and close attention. I mean, I thought the performances were all really good. And I actually didn't see them as all going for manic energy all the time. I thought it was great the way that, Justin Theroux brought a lot of nuance to that character that is at moments so hilariously cartoony, but at other times does seem kind of genuinely vulnerable. Like, I think that just, really, really worked for me. So yeah, I would definitely say it's one of my favorites of all time.
I mean, Matt, you said on Facebook, at times it's a little too metaphorical. What did you mean by that?
Well, I was trying not to be spoilery because we were on Facebook and people hadn't seen it. So I was basically talking about the idea that, like what I was saying before with dreams, that, sometimes when you're, in certain narratives, when you have a dream sequence and it doesn't relate at all to the plot, when there's no consequences. But I felt like this show, the dreams were revealing elements of the narrative of the characters. In other words, the dreams did have meaning and did have consequences to the overall story. So there were times, I think, where some of the dream sequences didn't quite work, like we spoke about, like the Lord of the Ring analog one. But overall, I found it really inventive. Fun. I mean, really, I just had fun watching.
Raj, any other thoughts you want to throw in here at the end?
I agree with Matt that it's not for everyone, although I just can't understand how that one guy found it boring, especially with that first episode. I think, just some of the ideas, I would never find any of those boring, but, people are different, so that's fine. I really enjoyed it. And actually, after talking about it here, I think I enjoy it more. I think the things that I appreciate the most are often the things that stay with me after I watch them, and the things that produce additional thoughts and resonance after I've completed them. And this is definitely one of those series. And again, Chandler, thank you so much, because there's layers to things that I didn't connect, and now I can go back and and enjoy it again. So yeah, I definitely, I don't know that I would say one of my favorite ever, because I'm really bad at ranking things, but I'm impressed. Let me say I'm impressed by pretty much everyone involved in this, and so I really enjoyed True Detective season 1. So I guess I'll have to check out Corey's next. Is it Corey or Cary? Cary? Cary's next thing, which apparently is an adaptation of the 80s movie Explorers, which is about kids.
I just saw that. That sounds so amazing.
Kids building a spaceship and going out into space. So.
What? That sounds great.
Yeah. I think he's also doing the next James Bond movie.
He is, which I am super, super excited about. So, Also, my girlfriend has a huge crush on him.
I guess I'll just say, sort of just on a more sort of abstract level, I think one of the difficulties I had with the show is that in the first episode, it's set up that it seems to be a show where you're not sure what's going to be real and what's not, and there seems to be this big cosmic conspiracy and a lot of paranoia. And then by the end, it turns out all that stuff was just kind of in his head, and it's sort of about making connections and finding a friend. And I just feel like I was always kind of more interested in the conspiracy, paranoia, cosmic mission, not knowing what's real kind of stuff. And I feel like any kind of story where you introduce the possibility that there's some big conspiracy, if it turns out like, oh no, actually there wasn't, I feel like is always going to be a letdown at some level.
It's Chekhov's conspiracy. If you have a conspiracy on the mantle. Yeah. I didn't mind that so much. I think it was just kind of a red herring. Like I said at the beginning, I thought that's what it was going to be about, sort of like Dark City Matrix type thing where there's like a reality underneath the reality. And I was like, oh, okay, I've seen this before. It's, is it going to go like this Black Mirror way and just be very dark and depressing? And I'm not sure if I'm ready to watch that. But I felt that it took a different turn. Yeah, that didn't bother me as much.
Yeah, I kind of think at the beginning of the show, the lives or fantasies that the characters are living in are the same way that we first encounter them. So like, we think that Annie's sister is alive, and we think that maybe Owen is the subject of some kind of conspiracy. I feel like that's kind of like a way of getting to know them on, where they're at that point in the story.
Yeah.
But I can see how it would be frustrating if you have to sort of switch your expectations.
It was also like a really good way, I thought, to just get you into his world, to get you into his head and say, this is how he experiences the world. And then so when you switch out of that, you're like, whoa, wait a minute. Like, I was completely disorienting. And I thought that was effective.
I still just want to know what the Statue of Extra Liberty is holding. I watched all 10 episodes, and they never told me.
It's a beer.
Maybe it's a brain and a scalpel.
Yeah. That makes more sense.
There's probably a Reddit thread somewhere where you can like dive deep into people's theories about what it's about and what it's holding and things like that.
There's also an amazing like cosplay thread on Reddit of all the people dressed up as Dr. Manta Ray and Dr. Izumi. It's pretty great.
Those are great Halloween costume ideas.
Yeah.
All right, well, I'm going to go right now and look up some fan theories about what the Statue of Extra Liberty is, because we're all out of time, so we got to wrap this up anyway. And so we've been speaking with Rajan Khanna, Chandler Klang Smith, and Matthew Kressel. So thanks, everyone, so much for joining us.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And that was our panel. So big thanks again to Rajan Khanna, Chandler Klang Smith, and Matthew Kressel for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to Jan, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.